It is a 7-decade-old mystery that has brought Ontario's provincial police to these northern woods. What they are looking for are graves.
We're going to walk about a mile. That's a long way to be hidden, I guess.
In 1941, 3 young boys went missing from here, never seen again. For years, the people of Fort Albany begged police to excavate what they believe is a 70-year-old crime scene.
That's all we want is some cooperation, some belief.
That's where we were told in an area that it was, so we're gonna make a wider perimeter so that we can search a little wider area than that.
Time has hardened the unanswered questions into a deep and abiding suspicion of what really went on in one of Canada's most notorious Indian residential schools. It was called St. Anne's, funded by the government and for decades administered by the Catholic orders of the Oblates and the Grey Nuns. Generations of children from remote James Bay communities were forced to attend the school. Running away was not uncommon.
The 3 boys ran away from the school one night in early to mid-April, and it was determined that the boys had tried to cross the river late at night to get to the other side, and in doing so, there was a breakup of ice at that time, and that they were likely washed out to sea.
That is the 70-year-old official story, but Cree elder Ed Metatawaban says a community story handed down through generations is that the 3 boys returned to the school and were punished to death.
It has to be looked at. It has to be investigated. The boys didn't die in the bush. They died under custody.
The charge is really that people at the school, people associated with the church, murdered 3 boys.
Yeah.
Is that conceivable to you?
Oh, yeah. The people that have received physical punishment, they know it's conceivable. So that's not beyond belief for us.
There is no school today. Fire destroyed the last remaining buildings 4 years ago. But talk to anyone who went here, and the memories still sear.
There's so many things that happened to them, happened to us when we were here.
74-year-old Angela Shishish was just 7 years old the first time she arrived at St. Anne's. Coming back was more than she could handle.
Right now, it seems that I'm traveling back in my younger days. I could hear the kids. Now we better go back.
You don't want to hear anymore?
No, I'm feeling too weak.
Okay, let's go back then. Come with me.
I remember we used to go in another building to go and take our breakfast. I didn't want to eat the porridge because it was too thick, didn't taste right. And the other girl that I saw, she got sick. Same thing happened to me. One of the helper, the big girls, was the one pulling my hair, and then was standing beside her, grabbed a spoon and fed me my vomit. Couldn't swallow it at first. Couldn't swallow it.
They called it a prison, and it must have felt like it. Instead of names, children were given numbers. Ed Metatawaban was number 4. He lived at St. Anne's till high school, later becoming one of his community's leaders. The punishment he remembers most sounds almost unbelievable.
We were electrocuted in the electric chair.
That's right. He says the school had a homemade electric chair.
It sat in the dormitory. If you don't behave, you will get electrocuted.
Can you describe for me what the chair looked like?
Metal handles for the armrest. And I think there was a continuous flow from the right side to the left side so that the current would travel through our bodies. People would cry, people would squirm, and different reactions.
There were priests, nuns, fear, isolation. St. Anne's was a petri dish for abuse. Angela Shishish remembers one priest in particular who would translate for the visiting dentist.
In those days, you know how when they used to give you a needle to freeze, it was very painful, eh? Mm. My hands were tied up like this, so was my legs.
Tied to the chair?
Yeah. And he says I saw two of them that I have to fix.
It was when the dentist left the room that the priest took over.
That priest started to kiss all over my face. And I was scared. And I cried, sitting in a chair like that. And the dentist came out. Are you afraid? You're crying? Are you afraid? And that priest kept on saying, yeah, afraid.
Mr. Speaker, I stand before you today to offer an apology to former students of Indian residential schools. The treatment of children in Indian residential schools is a sad chapter in our history.
In 2008, Canada's historic apology to residential school survivors came with a promise. In return for not suing the government, former students who could prove abuse would be compensated. The government would prepare a summary of what was known to have happened at each school. Adjudicators would decide what each claim was worth. As with most things bureaucratic, it got reduced to a formula. Points would be awarded for different kinds of abuse. Sexual abuse would get the most points of all. Based on that, St. Anne's survivors like Evelyn Korkmaz joined tens of thousands from across the country in filing claims.
I thought, good, I could, get some kind of compensation where somebody is acknowledging what happened to me. It was part of my healing process.
As a child, Evelyn was raped at St. Anne's repeatedly. For hours, she detailed the abuse for her adjudicator, only to have her claim denied.
He said he didn't believe you.
He didn't believe a word I said, no. It was traumatizing. I came home, I was shocked, couldn't believe that this was the process.
According to the adjudicator's report, Evelyn's account of her sexual abuse was not credible.
And nor, it seems, were other St. Anne's claims, which struck the former students as odd because there was a record of their abuse going back a decade and a half. In 1992, after years of silence, the community came together and decided it was time to start telling the stories of what went on at the school to police.
You want us to take the tape down, Greg? Yeah, we can do that shortly.
This is the Ontario provincial police officer who heard the stories first. In 1992, Greg Delgadis was just starting his policing career. He would come to know the St. Anne's community well. His investigation lasted 7 years.
What kinds of things were you hearing?
Physical and sexual abuse that was taking place on students from staff at the school, some religious personnel, some civilian staff at the school. There were also allegations of physical and sexual abuse on children by other children.
Widespread?
It was widespread, and it was systematic, and it was out of control.
By any standard, Delgadis' investigation was massive, one of the first in Canada to examine residential school abuse. 700 former students and staff were interviewed, more than 70 alleged perpetrators identified. And yet only 5 would be convicted, despite all the testimonies police collected.
Did I not believe them? Absolutely not. I believed every one of them. There was no issue with that. The Crown Attorney's Office spent nearly a year reviewing all allegations and deciding which ones would be marked for prosecution. And it was at the end of that those numbers showed up.
The OPP investigation consisted of more than 12,000 documents, but after the trials, they were filed away. The police had them, of course. The government would later admit it had copies too. And yet, when former St. Anne students started filing compensation claims, time and again, it seems no one knew what they were talking about.
We were surprised that they didn't know the story. We told the story to the police, and all of us thought we were telling it to the government. But they were coming to us as if they didn't know anything about what had transpired before.
Indeed, the government's official summary of St. Anne's, distributed to adjudicators, said there were just 4 known incidents of abuse at the school, all of them physical. No known sexual abuse at all. It was as if Detective Delgadiz's massive investigation had never happened.
When you heard that, what did you think?
Very disappointed in the whole matter. What kind of a cover-up is going on that they deny that there ever was even an investigation? I was on the investigation for 7 years. Absolutely, there was an investigation.
Children at St. Anne's residential school suffered nightmarish levels of abuse, and yet the Office of the Attorney General suppressed thousands of pages of police evidence that identified those perpetrators.
NDP MP Charlie Angus has been trying to get answers from the government for years.
When I learned that there were thousands of pages of police testimony and documents and evidence and the naming of the perpetrators that had gone on to reveal, this house of horrors, you expect as a Canadian that justice will be done, and then it never was done. And then when you see the process that's supposed to be in place for compensation and reconciliation, you think, man, it's a slam dunk for the survivors of St. Anne's. This should be a pretty straightforward process, and it wasn't.
Obviously, they were playing games. They didn't want to release the documents.
Because?
It implicates too many people. Implicates people in government. It implicates people in church. Why would you hide something if it doesn't implicate somebody?
When we come back, the St. Anne survivors go to court, and we reveal those police documents for the first time.
There's no respite from the darkness until you close it at the end.
Honorable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, the ills done to Indigenous people over decades and centuries of colonialism in this country are shameful and are something that we need to learn from and move forward on.
Since Canada started compensating survivors of Indian residential schools, nearly 40,000 claims have been approved. The payout has been more than $3 billion. But the government has also spent something approaching $3 million fighting survivors of St. Anne's residential school in court. In 2013, former students sued the government for access to documents they believed would prove their compensation claims. Documents collected as part of a 7-year police investigation. Investigative files aren't meant to be public. Few outside the police and government had ever seen this one. Until last year, when someone delivered CBC reporter Jorge Barrera a package.
I received 3 CD-ROMs of these documents in a brown paper envelope that was slid across a food court table at an Ottawa mall. And I didn't know what was actually in there until I got back, and I put it into my laptop, and I realized that these were the OPP documents from the investigations into St. Anne's.
Barrera had covered the survivors' court fight to get the documents, but even he had no idea of the darkness they contained.
Every single page almost in these documents was just an itemization of abuse and torture alleged by the people the OPP interviewed, and it was incredible. There's no respite from the darkness until you close it at the end.
What the documents confirm is what St. Anne survivors had claimed and been told there was no evidence to prove. That electric chair, it existed. There's even a diagram.
So this one has vomit.
The forced eating of vomit, there were dozens of accounts. Physical abuse was common at the school. A one-time principal, who later became bishop, was reported to have beaten a student unconscious with a whip. And then there was the sexual abuse that the government's official summary of St. Anne's concluded had never happened. According to the police documents, it was rampant. Children sexually assaulted by nuns, by priests, by school employees, and sometimes by each other. Of all the offenders, one of the worst was a priest who was at the school for nearly 4 decades, Father Arthur Lavoie.
Which one is he?
This one in the middle.
What do you know about him?
Always hung around with the girls and boys, and always he would start touching you here, and then his hands would fall down and touching you. He was always touching you.
For many, it went a lot further than that. Lavoie groomed his victims, told them the sex he forced on them would ensure their place in heaven. The OPP recorded 313 complaints against Lavoie. He died before he could be charged.
Is it credible, is it possible that the people who ran the school did not know that this abuse was going on?
I don't think that that's possible.
Why?
Because there were so many people doing it, and it was so out in the open.
So all of this information the government had for years and yet argued wasn't relevant to compensation claims. In the end, a judge told the government it was and ordered the documents be turned over to the St. Anne survivors. But that didn't end it. The government is still fighting survivors in court today as they demand their claims be reviewed. Some reconciliation, says Charlie Angus.
They've gone to the wall with the most excessive legal arguments to go after such marginalized people who are so clearly in the right, with a government that is so clearly committed to reconciliation, tells me that the dysfunction in Canada about justice for Indigenous people runs really, really, really deep.
The government says 96% of St. Anne's claimants did get some kind of compensation. But it won't say how many of those cases were adjudicated before the OPP documents were turned over. Won't say if the absence of those documents meant some people were denied compensation or at least got less than they were entitled to. The agency responsible for compensation claims told us answering our questions would take too much work.
Mr. Speaker, I want to be very clear with the member that we are not blocking reopening of cases.
Carolyn Bennett inherited the St. Anne's file from her Conservative predecessor. She's on record as saying mistakes were made. So what's she prepared to do to make things right?
Minister Bennett, hi. I'm Gillian Findlay from the
After refusing our request for an interview, we caught up with the minister in her constituency.
Can you tell us why it is the government continues to fight these people in court when they are simply trying to get compensation?
Well, as you know, we are not fighting them in court. They have decided to see us in court based on their lawyer's advice. We think they've been getting bad advice.
These are people who had information withheld from them by the government that they say has affected their ability to file proper claims and that they're owed money. What is wrong with reviewing? Why can't you at this moment say...
We are working with all of the St. Anne survivors to make sure that they get exactly what they deserve and more if possible.
They don't see that. They see the government fighting them yet again.
I think if you look at the Justice's statement on why there has been such difficulty, it is not on behalf of the government.
Ms. Bennett, why can't you just simply, as the minister, say enough of this? We've been fighting too long. Why don't you, as minister, say We want to review this, and we're going to review this, and we're going to do right by these people.
We are reviewing it, and we want to be at the table. That's where this will be solved. We don't want to be in court.
Why do these people not know that?
We don't want to be in court.
They want to sit down with you.
We want them to get everything they deserve.
Betrayal permeates everything when it comes to St. Anne's. Betrayal by government, betrayal by the Catholic Church. To this day, the Oblate order that ran the school has never admitted abuse happened here. And today, the sense of betrayal continues. The OPP search last fall lasted less than a day and found nothing. The mystery of the 3 missing boys endures. Ed Matatawaban was disappointed, but not surprised.
And inside was a statue of the Virgin Mary.
Time and again, he says, the people of Fort Albany have trusted the white man's notions of salvation and of justice. Like St. Anne's itself, trust is now gone.
They ran away. And what they left behind was a mess. I don't think we will ever recover in our own lifetimes what happened. They're still continuing to hide it until there's nobody left to fight, until all of us are gone.